Hello and welcome to Dialogue. U.S. President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin meet Friday at a sprawling U.S. military base in Anchorage, Alaska. Trump is calling it a feel-out meeting, the first face-to-face talks between U.S. and Russian leaders since 2021. What do they hope to achieve? Can they agree on or at least move toward a ceasefire in Ukraine? And what stands in the way of ending the conflict? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Jinduo. Joining me today are Andrey Kortunov, former academic director of the Russian International Affairs Council, Professor Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway, and later on, Professor Peter Kuznick from the Department of History at American University. Well, Andrey, welcome to Dialogue. I'll start with you. So what's the expectation from the Russian side of the summit?
Well, I think that the Russian leadership is trying to manage expectations. They say that it's the first meeting and they do not expect any documents to be signed. Of course, they would like to compare notes on the Ukrainian settlement, but also given the size and the composition of the Russian delegation, one can imagine that they expect to discuss issues of strategic stability as well as opportunities for economic and financial cooperation between the two nations.
Glenn, how do you look at the summit? Could people expect, probably too high hope for a ceasefire or a peace agreement, over Ukraine? And the summit itself, as Andrew mentioned, indicated, I guess it goes beyond the Ukraine issue. It's also about Russia-U.S. relationship there.
Yeah, no, I think this is why it's going to have to be a longer process. Many people only call for a ceasefire, but a ceasefire is not the same as peace. I think it's helpful to look at this conflict on three different levels. On one hand, you have the wider regional proxy conflict that is between NATO and Russia. And then, of course, you have the direct war now between Russia and Ukraine. But you also have an internal conflict within Ukraine, which has been going on since the coup in 2014. So I think in order to solve any of this, you have to get the big pieces in place first. And this is NATO-Russia. And when we say NATO, we really mean the United States. So it makes a lot of sense for the US and Russia to begin to talk about the bigger issues, such as the European security architecture, the future of NATO expansionism, what neutrality for Ukraine might mean. Of course, a lot of these issues have to be solved before you can really start to dig into the smaller issues. But I think that for the United States and Russia, given that they're now entering this multipolar world, they also have other interests. They would like to have better bilateral relations. They want to look in the Arctic. They want to look at trade. There's many other things that can be achieved once this Ukraine conflict has been put behind them. So I don't think a peace agreement will come out of this, but we've heard some positive statements coming then, especially from Russia, and but I don't think a deal can be made right away. But diplomacy is an important step. It's important to note that this is the first time an American and Russian president meet now for the past 3.5 years. So this is always good. One doesn't have to agree, but as long as they begin to talk again, I think this is an important first step.
Well, Andrea, as Glenn said, this is an important step in diplomacy. Are we expecting, more summit meetings between the two leaders this time around in the U.S. soil? Maybe next time, Trump's visit of Russia?
Well, this is what they clearly count on in Moscow. They mentioned that they have already dispatched an invitation to President Trump to visit Russia at some point. And of course, the diplomatic protocol assumes that if there is a meeting in one country, there should be reciprocity. So it's a matter of time. And of course, it's a matter of how far they might advance right now with the United States, because if this meeting, God forbid, is a failure, then it would be harder to plan another one in any location.
Well, Andrey, when it comes to the key issue here, of course, the whole world is focusing on the Ukraine crisis. I mean, it's been clear the Russian stance has been consistent, has been clear. That is about the territory, for example, the 4 regions, that's the Russian demands. And also, if you look at the Moscow, their demands also includes, to clarify or to take a close look at the root cause of the conflict over there. So that will be obviously an important part of the discussion there. So that will be unchanged, and that will be conveyed clearly to Trump himself.
Well, we do not know what Steve Witkoff, special representative of Donald Trump, brought back to Washington from Moscow. He visited the Russian capital in the beginning of August, and they argued that probably he has received some additional signals. So in the expert community, they speculate about what these signals might contain. For example, they say that probably it's about some kind of air ceasefire or a ceasefire in the Black Sea area, or maybe Russia would like to get back to its old idea of ban on strikes against energy infrastructure. So there are many ways, short of a complete ceasefire, that can be pursued and that can lead to a gradual de-escalation and hopefully later on to a complete ceasefire. But of course, we do not know. Maybe we will know in a couple of hours from now.
That's right. Glenn, if you look at the U.S. stance, interestingly, seems President Trump and his people are walking back actually from the previous stance. He a couple of days ago he talked about it's a complicated process, involving swap of territories. But now his people, for example, the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, built the summit as a listening exercise, and said the goal of his meeting of President Trump is to walk away with a better understanding of how we can end the war. Trump himself said it's a feel-out meeting. So, I mean, it seems like the talk of ceasefire is much, downgraded in terms of the expectation. Why? What's the goal of Trump here?
Well, he just had this massive threat against Russia. First, a 50-day ultimatum, then down to 10. He was going to send weapons and put massive sanctions. It's very hard to walk back a lot of this. So you see Trump on one hand saying that this is a listening exercise. We're just going to learn a little bit more about what Russia wants, after 3 or 11 years, to be honest. And then at the same time, he's also gone out and warned that if a deal isn't made with Putin, then there would be severe consequences. So he's a little bit all over the map. But this is, common in his character. It's unclear often why. Either he's just not sure, or he could simply be just very aware that he's operating in a very difficult position. Keep in mind that him sitting down with Putin is has a lot of resistance within Washington, within Europe, Zelensky. So I think some strategic ambiguity fits in, and this is something he tends to pride himself of as well. But again, the ceasefire, it can't really come until some major agreements have been reached, because from the Russian perspective, what they're asking for is quite, it's a tall order. They want for a stop to NATO expansion in order for Ukraine to restore its neutrality, and also they want huge territorial concessions. Now, this is why they invaded in 2022, and if they now would accept a ceasefire, where's the incentive for the Americans, Europeans, and Zelensky to accept any of the demands of Russia? So for the Russians, I don't think ceasefire has anything to do with peace. Peace means to address the underlying reasons behind this war. So I think they have they're still very far apart. And but again, I think something could be reached here. I think ideally there could be something about a future of the bilateral relations between the US and Russia. If they can also agree on the neutrality issue, that there will be no more NATO expansion, then I think all the other things could work itself out.
Glenn, you mentioned, referred to this criticism or pressure even from, say, within the U.S. and also from the European countries and Zelensky. They had a meeting on Wednesday. They urged President Trump, not to strike a deal with the Russian side, which might not serve the interests of Ukrainians or the Europeans. So in a sense, can we say Trump is also under pressure? He got to be careful, otherwise he could be looked at weak, or somehow could suffer from all the criticism, like that's a failure, whatever, agreement or consensus coming out of the summit?
No, I think definitely there's a reason why Reagan was able to sit down with the Soviets and negotiate. This was also very unpopular in Washington, but no one could accuse him of being pro-Russian or pro-Soviet. So it was easier for him than others. So it's, if you appear weak, then the common phrase we have across the West is, "Oh, you have to be tough on Russia." This idea that we always have to negotiate from a position of strength. So I do think there's a need to put on a little bit of aggressive act, which is probably why when he threatens Russia every now and then, the Russians understand the internal dynamic within the U.S. and the political West and accept it. But it has to be said, though, that in terms of what is good for the West and Ukraine, this Alaska summit doesn't come out of nowhere. The Ukrainian military is collapsing, and there's not much that can be done. Trump said he would send weapons. There's not that much weapons to be sent. Also, NATO has begun to run out of Ukrainian soldiers. There's a huge manpower problem, and the front lines are cracking. Trump also said he could put these damning sanctions on Russia, but we've already seen that the Chinese and Indians are prepared to ignore the secondary sanctions. So he doesn't really have any more cards to play. So if there's a worse deal tomorrow than there is today, then it's more likely that they will embrace a deal today.
Mm-hmm. Andrey, of course, Trump threatened Russia with more tariffs and higher tariffs, and also secondary tariffs on possible partners of Russia, trade partners like China, like India, Turkey, and other countries. So what kind of pressure is that to Moscow? Do you think decision makers in Moscow feel heat from Trump?
Well, I think that in Moscow they are more or less accustomed to see more and more sanctions. Not a long time ago, there was another package of sanctions from the European Union, and in Brussels they are already working on yet another package which has to be approved already in September. So it is not something that would come as a surprise for Russia. Of course, in many ways, there is a new approach in Washington, or at least on the Hill. They would like to focus on secondary sanctions to hit Russia's partners, so that these partners might try to influence the Russian behavior. But it is not that easy to implement secondary sanctions. Because, of course, that would come with political consequences for the United States. Look at the U.S.-India relations. I think it's a very clear illustration that the political price for imposing secondary sanctions on your partners might be pretty high. And also, to some extent, we can argue that Trump is not very consistent in his threats. He announced these 50 days. Then he reduced this 50 days term to just 10 or 12. He has already passed the deadline. The deadline was August 8th, but nothing really happened. Of course, that questions the credibility of his promises. But having said that, I would like to add that, of course, sanctions are a serious challenge for Russia. And I think that whether we like it or not, but to some extent, a new wave of sanctions might have an impact on trade relations between Russia and its strategic partners from the global south. So, of course, I think in Moscow, they will do their best to avoid such developments if they have an opportunity to do so. That might be one of the motivations behind this rather urgent summit meeting that was planned just within a couple of days. It's not how summits are usually prepared.
Well, Andrew, of course, if you look at the European response, then there's this allegation that the Russian economy is in collapse, or the Russian is facing mounting difficulties, or they are blaming China, India for doing business with Russia, etc. How do you characterize the Russian position in terms of the economy, in terms of the situation in the battlefield?
Well, let me start with saying that I think the Russian economy has demonstrated quite impressive resilience because there were statements 3.5 years ago, that the Russian economy would collapse, that the Russian social fracture would implode, and that Russia will basically experience a regime change. And nothing like that happened, and nothing like that is likely to happen anytime soon. So the Russian system turned out to be quite resilient, at least in terms of the general macroeconomic situation. And I think that this resilience will be with us for a long time. So this is clear, but at the same time, definitely sanctions bite, especially sanctions by the European Union, because if you look back, the United States has never been a major trading partner for the Russian Federation. In many ways, Russia competes with the United States in energy markets, in agricultural markets, in arms markets, and so on. But Europe is important. My take is that basically the damage inflicted upon the Russian-European economic partnership is already beyond repair. I don't think that we will get back to where we were in early 2022. So basically, Russia has already paid a high price for breaking relations with the European Union, but it is adjusting, and I think that there is no way to get back.
Welcome, Peter. So we mentioned a little bit about Trump walking back from his talk of territory swap. He's now talking about he's not sure of a ceasefire will come out for this summit. So is he getting more realistic, or is he under pressure? What's the expectation from the U.S. side of the summit?
Trump is under enormous pressure right now. The Europeans, so-called coalition of the willing, means the coalition of those who are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. They're putting a lot of pressure on Trump. Zelensky's putting pressure on Trump. There are some within his own administration who are putting pressure. People like Marco Rubio have been Russia hawks from the far back. So Trump is sticking his neck out. He knows that the stakes are high. He's been trying to claim credit for every positive move around the globe right now. He wants that Nobel Peace Prize. I know what that's about because I nominated the current winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, and I was part of the delegation in Oslo. I'm sorry I didn't see Glenn when I was there, but so Trump, but seems to be wanting to do the right thing. He's so oscillating. He say one thing one day, something the opposite the next day, and it's a very difficult problem. I mean, Russia, there are three fundamental lies here, as I see it. Number one, that this was an unprovoked invasion. It might have not been justifiable, but it was certainly provoked. Number two, that the Ukrainians are going to somehow get back that territory. And number three, that if Putin gets a win in Ukraine, he's going to go after Europe. He's going to start picking off one piece of Europe after another. None of those are true. But the reality is that, and that Ukraine is in a terrible position. Those who are friends of Ukraine and wanted to keep fighting are not real friends. Because if the fighting goes on, 6 months from now, Ukraine is going to be in a worse position than they are now. Russia is advancing on the battlefield. Ukraine is collapsing basically on the battlefield. And Russia will have more territory. There'll be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly more dead and wounded on both sides. So from a Ukrainian standpoint, this is absolutely in their interest. Even the majority now, overwhelming majority in Ukraine, are willing to want to negotiate a settlement, even if it's more on Russia's terms than they would have wanted 2 or 3 years ago. Uh, but there's a lot of people who are resisting, and especially the Europeans uh, and Zelensky. But most within Ukraine would be happy to see a settlement now. And I think this is the best terms that Ukraine is going to get. It's sort of like worrying about getting older. You have to realize that today is the youngest you're ever going to be. And you might not like it, but that's the reality. And for the Ukrainians, it's similar. Today is the strongest position they're going to be in. And, and they're better off making the concessions, or some of the concessions at least, and sitting down and negotiating. Whether or not Putin would actually demand the entirety of the 4 oblasts that he's taken, he's only taken one, Luhansk, in total, and he's demanding the rest be turned over. Maybe he'll negotiate on that. Maybe he'll compromise on that. There are other places for compromise, but not on NATO admission, and not on keeping at least most of the territory they've already taken on the battlefield. So I think that's the reality. We might not want that reality. We might not want to see these changes in the nuclear age, but let's look more positively about the positive outcomes that could come from this in terms of improving U.S.-Russian relations, in terms of possible joint Arctic development, in terms of the possibility of a Bering Strait tunnel, in terms of the possibility of a New START treaty or something to replace that, rather than the nuclear anarchy that we're facing. So there could be some positives. And what I'd like to see is Putin, Trump, and Xi sit down together in Beijing in early September at the Chinese commemoration of the end of World War II. I mean, we need to move the world in a different direction, and this could give us the opportunity to do that.
Right. But Peter, briefly on the Ukraine issue, is it possible, like, the two leaders, reach a consensus to start somewhere to de-escalate the crisis? For example, no airstrikes from either side, or, somewhere, or like a framework of, what they are going to do in terms of the war, in terms of the European security framework, or bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
Yes, we can certainly begin a framework, but we're going to have to get Zelensky involved in the discussions, because what we want is an enduring peace, not just a ceasefire that they're going to go back to fighting in 2 months or not 60 or 30 days. What we want is something that's going to actually end this, and it's going to have to be a win-win. I'm not exactly sure what the win is going to be for Zelensky other than ending the fighting. But Ukraine is going to have to buy into this, or else we're going to see guerrilla warfare. We're going to see prolonged fighting. We're going to see it flare up again. It was really stupid of NATO and wrong of NATO to push the expansion the way they did, and also, this could have and should have been prevented with the Minsk II agreement, and it could have been ended with the Istanbul Accords. But the West wanted a win against Russia. They wanted to weaken Russia. They saw this as their opportunity. They've been salivating over this prospect for a long, long time.
Right.
And they misplayed their hand.
Yeah, overplayed their hands. Well said, Glenn. But in the current process of like ending the crisis, but at least what we are seeing is that the European leaders are absent from the tables. And decisions are made inside the room at the table, and they are not there. What does that mean to the European Union, for example? European countries there, many of them are, showing this, I would say, determination to continue to support Ukraine, to fight to the last point. We don't know where that is, but anyway, continue to fight.
Yeah, I think continue to fight is a better word than to support, because the vast majority of Ukrainians, the Gallup poll says 69% of Ukrainians want the war to come to an end and negotiate. But I think this is the position the Europeans locked themselves in under Biden, of course, was we're going to boycott all diplomacy and do not talk to the Russians, and cut all economic ties and just continue to pump weapons into this, which now they lock themselves in a very unfortunate position, because at the moment the European leaders are not even pushing for these talks. They're putting excessive and unrealistic demands, and to be honest, they act as spoilers to this. So this is the key problem. So they can't even meet in Europe now, because we don't have neutral countries in Europe. They threaten to arrest Putin if he comes. So it's very difficult to include them, and they want a seat at the table, but they don't want to talk to the Russians. So there's too many contradictions, and I think at the moment both the Americans and the Russians see the Europeans as trying to hold to keep the war going. Indeed, as the former or current intelligence chief in Germany said, it would be better to keep the war going for another 5 years, so the Europeans can prepare themselves for a future conflict with Russia. So I think this is what Europe wants. They want Trump to go back to the Biden policies, that is, to do not sit down with Putin, instead continue the sanctions, just pump more weapons in, and go for the long game. And it's very unfortunate, I think, because the war has now been lost, and every day that passes, the Ukrainians lose more men, they lose more territory. It's not going to be possible to rebuild the country with all the human losses in terms of deaths, and also people fleeing the country and infrastructure being destroyed. So I think the best for everyone would be to again go to the roots of this conflict and address it. But I think, as I said, the Europeans kind of locked themselves into this ideological corner, where they think they're refighting World War II. Putin is Hitler, so any diplomacy is another form of appeasement, and it has to be avoided. So I think this is, as I said, very, very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrey, if the Europeans, their goal is to continue the war so they can prepare for probably, I don't know, like a big war or confrontation with Russia and between Russia and European countries. You think Moscow is prepared for this? Like the relationship with the Europeans will certainly, it's very hard for them to turn around, at least in the near term.
Well, I think that in Moscow, they do not believe in a real strategic autonomy of the European Union from the United States. The perception is that if there is a deal, some kind of a deal between Putin and Trump, then it will be up to Trump to deliver Europeans. Trump will have to negotiate with his partners in Europe. He will have to make sure that they do not act as spoilers, and that they would subscribe to whatever might be decided between Moscow and Washington. On top of that, it's not clear whether Europeans can fully replace the United States as the main supporter of the Ukraine war effort. There are many doubts that Europe, in its current shape, can afford to replace the United States in full, especially in certain sophisticated types of weapons. So there are concerns in Moscow about the European position. There are reasons here to believe that Europe might stick to its current position, at least for some time. But there are expectations that Trump will be in a position to discipline his partners within the NATO alliance, and they would not obstruct a deal which can be discussed between Putin and Trump.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Jinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.